Chris Rightford, you left the advertising industry, you became a game ranger. I mean, that's a heck of a diverse, it's almost like out of the hot water into the cold water. Money-wise, it must have been a nightmare.
Well, yes, it was. I mean, it certainly wasn't something that, if you're building a big financial future, it wasn't the right thing to do. But from an experiential point of view, it's probably the best thing I ever did in my entire life. I grew up in the Cape. I had no real knowledge of what the bush was about. And I happened to be working in Johannesburg and started going down to the Lowveld. And I just fell in love with it. And I just thought, if I'm going to make a move, I had to make a move at that stage of my life.
Buffalo Ridge Safari Lodge.
Yeah.
Let's hear about that, because it's quite a unique situation, isn't it? It's not the Mala Mala, Sabi Sabi type situation.
No, look, Mala Mala and Sabi Sabi and Londolozi were pioneers in the industry. And I mean, if you go back to 1994, pre-1994, there were probably maybe 20 to 30 lodges around the country that were known internationally. I mean, today we have thousands of lodges, and we have game reserves which have popped up all over the show. So I think it's been an amazing journey from a conservation expansion point of view. And a lot of private land that was in private hands, and particularly under farming management and agricultural management, has been converted into conservation land, and I think it's been fantastic for the industry.
But the unique side of it is the ownership, isn't it?
With regard to Buffalo Ridge, absolutely. It's the concession, and it is a concession, was awarded to the Balete Balechapung community, which are a small community that were moved from pillar to post under apartheid. And when Northwest Parks developed Madikwe Game Reserve, what they did is they identified 4 communities as beneficiary communities. We first got involved with another company called Mafisa Consulting around 1998, and started working with the Northwest Parks and with the community. And it basically took about 6 years from first working with the community till we ultimately opened the lodge.
What did the community get out of it? I mean, it's very nice, and it is owned
Yeah.
by the people who live on the land, which
Yeah.
is a unique and very nice idea. But
Yeah.
what do they get out of it? Financially, do they derive anything?
Yes, they do. They get a percentage of turnover. So it's not based on profitability, it's turnover. And that goes directly to the community trust. The way the deal was essentially structured is that the concession was awarded to the community by Northwest Parks and Tourism Board. We then worked with the community in terms of setting up and developing the lodge. The community members were sent to University of the Northwest on a training course regarding how to be a trustee and your roles and responsibilities of being a trustee. So the trust was established, which became the contracting entity between the community and whoever else it was.
There's an obvious question I must ask you, which we haven't touched on now, and that is the accommodation there.
Yeah.
We talk about guests coming on there.
Yeah.
What kind of accommodation are you supplying? I mean, how does it stand up to other safari lodges? Is it 5-star? Is it medium? Or how does it figure in the list of safari parks?
When we set the lodge up, when we worked with the community, we said to them we needed to be able to compete with all the other lodges in the area. And you couldn't just be seen as a community-owned lodge, because it almost becomes an excuse for
being Spartan?
Yeah, and not maybe having similar standards to somewhere else. So you're actually asking people to pay a similar rate to going elsewhere, but to accept less in return. And in fact, we cannot operate that way. You have to be competitive. So when the lodge was developed, it was developed as a 5-star operation. It was designed by a well-known architect in Tim Pluman, or rather Nick Pluman. It was done in that particular way. We've had to cut on a few areas. We don't have big spacious bathrooms with big spacious baths. We also have a water problem, and right now we're in the midst of probably the worst drought in 80 years. We've tried to allow, or almost allow the bush to come into the lodge and take over the feel of the lodge. So the central lodge is quite open, quite airy and spacious, and it's built on 2 or 3 different levels. And we can close it for the weather, if need be, with canvas. But for the rest of the time, it's quite open. So we've almost felt that we need to bring the bush into the lodge so the people feel that they're part of it. I think very often you can go to some lodges where, you know, you've got a big glass wall in front of you and you're here and the bush is out there.
Let's talk about what's on there, the big 5. What of the big 5 exist on
All of the
display?
big 5 are there. And in addition to that, wild dog and cheetah. And wild dog and cheetah are seen regularly.
There's another thing that you do there called Nature Workshop.
Yes.
Now, what do you actually mean by Nature Workshop? What are you offering and who comes for it?
Actually, it was just a name that we developed, we called ourselves. We just felt that when we originally established the business, that we were in the business of looking after our natural environment, and we felt as a core ideal that you had to make communities benefit from conservation and the wilderness. You can't just have a game reserve and expect that the communities outside are not going to have an impact. I mean, they want that land either for agricultural or grazing purposes, and we need to make sure that those communities benefit in some way and give them a reason to look after the conservation of that reserve, or all reserves and all our natural spaces. So that was the core philosophy behind the Nature Workshop. So it really is an ecotourism business that was created to, firstly, and not necessarily in this order, but the idea was to grow and develop conservation. And the only way that we felt that we could do that was by making sure that communities were involved in those initiatives and that they could benefit from it in some way or another. And the more that you can involve, that people benefit from a particular space, the less they feel the need to then go into that space and poach or whatever else they would need to do. So you're removing that desire to go in and take that space back. So communities have to benefit. And we've seen it in northern KwaZulu-Natal with Ndumo Game Reserve. The communities are being neglected. They've broken down the fences. They've gone in. They've taken some of the land. They've taken the trees out and tilled it and planted crops. It's a demand for land and space. And if we've got to make that work. And so that's the core philosophy behind the Nature Workshop, has been to try and encourage development and growth of ecotourism and community-based initiatives surrounding conservation wilderness areas.
Let's move now to that awful, awful subject of poaching.
Yeah.
You, by the sound of it, aren't suffering with that kind of situation.
Madikwe has been, touch wood, very fortunate. There has been some poaching. There's a very healthy rhino population within the reserve. And we have lost some, but not even close to the way it's being done and the way Kruger National Park's been impacted, for example.
It's horrific.
It's absolutely horrendous. But yeah, I mean, and again, it goes back to communities benefiting and seeing some benefit from those reserves. And, you know, unfortunately with Kruger, you've got this very long boundary with Mozambique. And most of it is it's coming from that side. It's not necessarily coming from within